What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and today we're going to be taking a look at one of the largest pots ever played in live stream history. It happened late last year on The Hustler. Let's go ahead and jump into the action.
I like this game. Sit down game, stand up game.
This is team.
Stand up.
9,000.
9,000 here from Handz.
This is your team.
Stand up? You think so?
Aggressive.
This is my very first time playing.
My dog's so disgusted he ripped his Hermes scarf off. It's like I've had enough of this place.
Our hand begins at 200, 400, 800, 1600, and I believe there's a 3200 on. So essentially at this point, we're just saying numbers. The action folds around to Handz on the button, who opens up with ace-7 offsuit to 9,000, which is a reasonable hand to open on the button. I will say when there's a ton of straddles, you actually will start to fold some aces on the button because there's so many guys to get through. But in this spot seems to be a good spot to open it up. He makes it $9,000 to go. Yes, that's right. The pre-flop open is $9,000. And now the action's on Ben in the small blind. Ben looks down at 8-5 of clubs. This hand's probably a little bit too weak to play out of position. You could argue maybe when you're really deep it makes more sense. But because this pot has been straddled up so large, you're really not going to be able to play this one profitably. I'd recommend letting it go. He does decide to make the call, and now the action's on Eric Person, who looks down at ace-jack offsuit. I think this is a pretty standard spot just to go ahead and re-raise. Ace-jack benefits a lot from knocking players out of the pot and isolating down to just a heads-up situation where you're going to get to have some good opportunities to either bet the flop or flop top pair against a much smaller field of opponents. When you call, it's kind of likely you're going to end up having the best hand here pre-flop, or at least be an equity favorite versus the other players. However, unless you hit, it's going to be difficult for you to take it down. Anyway, he does decide to call, which is probably still a good play. I just prefer 3-bet. And now the action's on Keating in the largest blind, the straddle here with the king deuce of spades. Given the number of players in this pot and the fact that he has a suited king, this is definitely a situation where you're going to want to go ahead and make the call, which he does, and let's take a flop.
Too hot with it on, right? Yeah.
Chip.
Oh, Keating flops a king high flush draw.
25.
Handz has got ace-7 with the ace of spades. This is going to start a c-bet here.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
And Keating calls.
The flop comes 10-6, 5-2 spades, so a lot going on here. We've got bottom pair for Ben. We've got the second nut flush draw here for Keating. We've got the nut flush draw blocker for Handz, and Eric misses the flop, once again showing why you might want to 3-bet this one pre-flop and take it down to avoid situations that happen like this one. The action checks around to Handz, who decides to bet $25,000 into a pot about $37,000, so something like 2/3 pot or so. I will say when you get a lot of players in the pot, you typically want to use some small sizes on the flop because the logic is if people have missed the flop, they're going to fold anyway. And so there are a lot of hands that don't care too much between small and medium size. So a small size will still thin the field out and give you a much better price on the bet. That said, there are still some hands that definitely would prefer to bet this kind of size, a hand like ace-10 or jacks. Maybe a hand like fives, those kinds of hands where you can get some value, but maybe they're either vulnerable or they don't block some continues. Those hands tend to like a bigger size. However, I'd probably advocate for using something more around $12,000, $13,000 here if you do decide to bet. Anyway, Handz does decide to bet. I actually like betting this hand. He's going to get some interesting runouts to barrel. He can barrel on straight draws, or if the flush comes in. He has a lot of playability on later streets, and so he's going to get some good opportunities to put his opponents into some tough spots. Once he bets $25K for Ben, definitely a spot you want to get out of the way. You do have a pair. He, in fact, is ahead of Handz right now. In fact, he's ahead of everyone here with in terms of just showdown value with having a pair, but not a spot where you can continue because there are so many players left behind you, and it's just so likely that you're beat. Kind of illustrating why this hand pre-flop, typically not one you're probably going to want to be playing in the smallest blind facing a button open. Ben does decide to fold. Now to Eric. You know, we talked about this already on the flop. Missed the flop 4 ways. Just going to have to fold here. Not that much you can do. He does decide to get out of the way, which is a prudent laydown. And now the action's on Keating. When you're facing a small bet, you might want to raise this hand a little more often on the flop. But when your opponent uses big sizes, you typically either want to be calling or folding. The reason is that the larger your opponent bets, the more polarized they are. Typically, when someone is polarized, they either have a very good hand or a very bad hand. And so raising is usually not that great of a play. If they have air, you want to let them continue to barrel. If they have a good hand, you don't want to build this pot. So this is a spot where I would not have all too many raises facing a 2/3 pot bet into 3 players or onto a 4-player flop. Anyway, Alan does decide to go ahead and make the call, and let's take a turn.
87,000 here. Turn is a 4, so Handz turns open-ended. Keating has the bottom end of a gut shot, which wouldn't be good if it comes in. So a little combo draw, but the 3's no good.
70.
And Handz gonna bet 70,000. And this pot is getting up there, 227,000.
The turn comes in offsuit 4. Neither player has improved in terms of showdown value. However, they've both picked up some straight draws. Handz has an open-ender with his 7, and Keating also has a gutter with his deuce. Keating checks once again, and now Handz decides he's going to barrel this turn. This is actually a really nice spot to bet. When you have the ace of spades in your hand, you know your opponent does not have the nut flush draw. This means that when you do bet, you're going to get way more folds because there aren't nut flush draws that will continue facing this action. So having the ace of spades here is a good card to keep bluffing. I'll note quickly, if the river bricks, this is a bad card to bluff the river because now you want them to have the nut flush draw. But on the turn here, it is a good card to have when you bet. Also, when you have a 7, you make it less likely your opponent has 8-7 or 7-3, or even a hand like 7-6 or pocket 7s, which could definitely call the turn now that it has an open-ender. As far as the size goes, Handz does bet pretty big here. He bets 70,000 to 87,000. It's maybe slightly large, but definitely could be a fine bet as well. One thing I'll say on bet size is there's a lot of different strategies that you can use, so it doesn't mean one is inherently good or bad. However, this is a percentage of pot that isn't used that much, so it's hard to say about this specific size, but I'm going to go ahead and say that this bet is totally fine. Now over to Keating with his flush draw. This is actually a very difficult spot. He has very little showdown value. He does now have a straight draw with a 3, where he could beat some hands like overpairs or sets. He also does, of course, have a spade that can give him the second nut flush, and a king is likely going to be a good card as well. His pot odds do suck, so this is a kind of classic poker hands. We could either go for a fold, call, or raise. I really don't mind any of them. I think raising is maybe a little bit too aggressive because I think I'd rather have a hand with a 7 or an 8 in it where I block the nut straight and I have some straight outs that I can really believe in. But this hand's right on that cusp either way. I wouldn't be surprised to see solvers do a little bit of all 3 options, probably lean towards call or fold. Not sure, guys. It's a tough one. Anyway, not tough for Alan. He makes the call. Let's take a river.
And the river's the 7 of spades. So Keating here makes the king high flush. Handz has the ace of spades in his hand. The one-liner out there, too. And Keating is going to lead. Doesn't want this one to get checked through, it looks like. And boy, that looks like 120, something like that.
How much?
155. 155,000. And would Handz ever think about doing something? He's got the ace of spades in his hand. He knows Keating doesn't have the nut flush, but if Keating ever had a flush, I don't know if he's ever folding.
The river comes the 7 of spades. This is a really interesting card. Obviously, Keating now is the second nuts, but just in terms of theory of the things that are going on. Keating decides to go ahead and lead for a 2/3 pot. This is the first decision I'd say I really don't love from Keating. The reason is that even though he does have a bunch of flushes in this situation, the out of position player is not really going to have that many straights. Think about it. What hands with an 8 in it could call in the flop? There's a couple, but there's really not that many. Maybe a hand like 10-8 of diamonds, 6-8 of diamonds. 6-8 just suited, probably going to fold the turn. It's kind of hard to think about too many hands here that might be calling on that turn. And then also it's kind of hard for him to have a 3. So the in-position player has lots of 8s and 3s and flushes. The out-of-position player just has a bunch of flushes. Typically speaking, when the out-of-position player doesn't have as many of these good hands, you just want to go ahead and check everything. Now, it could make sense to have some small leads. You could throw in a couple bluffs here and there, but all in all, I would just check all of my hands here over to my opponent and play my range out of that. Keating has other ideas, though. He decides to go ahead and lead for 2/3 pot. Certainly a reasonable play to make here with the second nut flush. Now over to Handz. Handz has kind of the absolute perfect hand to bluff here with. The reason is that he has the ace of spades. So essentially, it is not possible that Keating can have a nut flush kind of hand, right? Because he knows that the nut flush is not possible. Also, he doesn't have a hand that's strong enough really to want to be looking at a call. If there is some chance that Keating has an 8 here, although I think it's kind of unlikely with this size, this is not the kind of hand that you can just call the river. If he had ace 8, for example, he could certainly consider just a call. Same thing with ace 3. Ace 3, ace 7, probably similar, but those hands are straights plus the ace of spades, could definitely lean more towards a call. It's kind of hard to imagine too many other ace of spades hands that can get here, maybe ace 10 or aces. But the bottom line here is Handz can have a bunch of hands that are the nut flush, and he also does need to sometimes rip this in with the ace of spades, knowing his opponent can't have the nuts. And this is where I'm driving this hand at. I think this is one of those plays where most players would just be too afraid because of simply the amount of dollars on the table to make this move as Handz. But if you're going to play in a poker game, regardless of the stakes, if you're not going to be comfortable to make a play like this, which is a good play, even though your opponent has the second nuts, you need to make sure you're playing in games where you feel comfortable enough to make this kind of decision, because all in all, I really like this decision to pull the trigger.
Hi, Marvin.
And he's all in. Handz is going to pull a bluff raise all in with a stiff ace of spades. Unbelievable. Keating here with the king high flush. Loses to the ace high flush, and there is a straight flush combo out there too. So 846,000. $309,000 to call. If Keating finds the call button here, this is going to be over $1 million pot. Unbelievable. It has not been Handz' night here tonight. And they have pretty much kind of the same stack. Handz has 700 behind. They started with just about the same amount. So Keating getting just under 3-1 with the king high flush. I mean, we've never seen Keating make a fold this big.
That's annoying. I should be happy.
King high flush
Always happy
against
though, huh?
just the naked ace of spades. It's 326 to call. 847 for 326. If he calls, this will be 1.16 million. And he calls!
Good.
He makes the call. $1.2 million in real money. That's the biggest pot we have ever had on this show.
Well, I guess in theory, right? I mean, in reality, he lost $500,000, which seems not good. But theoretically, it seems fine. If you liked today's video, guys, hit that thumbs up button. I'm back. I'm making some content, so make sure to subscribe, like this video, turn on notifications. Let's get rolling, guys. It's been a little bit since I've been in the content streets, but I'm back. I'm ready to go.